Administration is taking aim at a major Canadian export. The U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%.
On lumber going across the line is just ridiculous. There's over 250 small manufacturing family-run companies like us in BC. It's going to kill thousands of jobs.
The effects of the new tariff hit real businesses and workers almost immediately. By late July, just a few months after the trade conflict reignited, Weyerhaeuser dropped some unsettling news. In its Q2 2025 earnings report, the timber giant revealed that its profits had taken a nosedive, falling by about 50% compared to the same period the year before. In terms of actual dollars, net income dropped from around $173 million in spring 2024 to just $87 million in 2025. A 9-figure profit had effectively been cut in half. Even though the company brought in approximately $1.9 billion in revenue, slightly better than analysts expected, that was little consolation given the steep drop in profits. Weyerhaeuser also missed Wall Street's earnings per share expectations, and during its investor call, company executives had to field some tough questions. Leadership didn't try to sugarcoat the situation either. They made it clear the turbulence was far from over. In fact, they warned that adjusted profit for the third quarter would likely come in about $60 million lower than Q2's already weakened results. In simple terms, the company saw more trouble ahead. So, what was behind this sharp decline? 3 major challenges were to blame. First, demand for wood products had softened as rising interest rates slowed down home construction and renovation activity. Second, lumber markets were oversaturated. Inventory had piled up in many regions, making it difficult for sellers to command strong prices. And third, costs were climbing throughout the supply chain, in part due to the new tariff landscape. Everything from raw timber to finished products became more expensive or harder to source. Prices for both standard lumber and engineered wood panels were falling, and home builders were getting nervous. While there were faint signs that lumber prices might be stabilizing, any relief was minimal. Altogether, it painted a grim short-term outlook for Weyerhaeuser and signaled broader trouble for the entire industry. Still, the company didn't just sit back and hope for the best. Weyerhaeuser took action to reinforce its position. One strategy was investing in more timberland, acquiring forest acreage in key regions. The bet was simple. Owning more land now could deliver long-term gains. At the same time, the company poured resources into expanding its capacity to produce higher-margin engineered wood products such as specialty panels and structural composites. To reassure shareholders, leadership also approved a $100 million stock buyback program, signaling confidence in the company's value and long-term resilience. In short, Weyerhaeuser chose to respond to the trade turmoil with strategy and strength. Much of the company's success still depends on the health of the housing market, and by summer 2025, that market was under serious pressure. The U.S. housing sector was caught in a squeeze from both sides. On one hand, borrowing costs had soared due to the Federal Reserve's earlier interest rate hikes. On the other, the cost of building materials surged, fueled by the new lumber tariffs. Together, these factors started to suck the life out of a housing boom that had been roaring just a couple of years earlier. In May, sales of new single-family homes in the U.S. experienced their sharpest decline in nearly 3 years, a clear sign that the momentum had stalled. Would-be buyers, already struggling with the highest mortgage rates in over a decade, were now facing even higher costs for building materials. At the same time, housing inventory ballooned. Developers grew cautious, and buyers began holding back. Homes were staying on the market longer. Properties that once sold quickly now lingered without offers. Sensing the pressure from both high construction costs and hesitant consumers, many home builders paused planned projects. Instead of charging ahead, they opted to wait, hoping conditions would improve. One big factor behind this pause was the growing unpredictability of lumber costs. Lumber prices had always been somewhat volatile, but the tariff situation added even more uncertainty. A load of framing lumber that might have been affordable a year ago could now fluctuate wildly in price from month to month, making budgeting nearly impossible for builders. In this environment, many developers decided it was smarter to hold off rather than risk building during a potential downturn. And there's a hard number that shows just how much these trade policies could affect home buyers. Some industry estimates suggest that if the tariffs remain in place, they could add as much as $14,000 to the cost of building a typical single-family home by 2027. Think about that. Nearly $15,000 extra, just because of trade policy. At a time when housing affordability is already a crisis for many families, that kind of increase can push home ownership out of reach or force builders and buyers to cut back on quality. Industry advocates sounded the alarm. The National Association of Home Builders warned that the tariffs risked making the affordability crisis even worse, especially while interest rates remained high. Still, supporters of the tariffs, including the U.S. Lumber Coalition, a powerful group of domestic lumber producers, stood firm. They acknowledged that higher costs might hurt construction in the short term, but they argued that it was a necessary correction. From their point of view, Canadian producers had been flooding the U.S. market with unfairly cheap lumber for years, harming American mills. In their eyes, temporary pain was worth it if it meant restoring the health of the domestic lumber industry. They pointed out that when U.S. mills are operating at full strength, supply becomes more reliable, and prices could eventually stabilize at more sustainable levels. Not everyone was on board with the U.S. tariff strategy. Critics argued that building materials, especially lumber, had already been driving up housing costs in recent years. Adding steep tariffs, they said, only made things worse. And the damage wasn't limited to just builders and buyers. It rippled backward through the entire supply chain. With fewer construction projects breaking ground, sawmills started processing fewer logs. Wood product factories received fewer orders, and logging crews in the forests had less work. For companies like Weyerhaeuser and others in the industry, this chain reaction translated into thinner profit margins and tough business decisions. The housing market was being squeezed from both ends, high costs for consumers and shrinking opportunities for suppliers. From forest operations to construction sites, every link in the chain was feeling the pressure. Canada wasn't going to sit back and take the hits without responding. As U.S. tariffs started to take effect, the Canadian government shifted its approach, from expressing frustration to taking strategic action. Ottawa began identifying potential pressure points, places where Canada could quietly remind the U.S. just how intertwined their economies truly are. One surprising fact was brought to light by Canada's Minister of International Trade, Dominic LeBlanc. He pointed out that Canadian pension funds and institutional investors hold a massive stake in the U.S. financial system, around $1 trillion in American assets and growing by about $100 billion each year. This wasn't a threat to pull out funds, but it was a clear signal. Canada has real economic influence too. If trade relations continued to sour, there were ways to recalibrate that capital, and doing so could have serious implications for U.S. markets. Prime Minister Mark Carney, formerly a central banker with a deep background in global finance, stood firm in response to Washington's demands. Carney made it clear that any new softwood lumber agreement would have to prioritize protecting Canadian jobs and communities. He flatly rejected the idea of being rushed into a deal just to meet President Trump's August 1st deadline. In public interviews, Carney stated that Canada would only negotiate under fair terms and wouldn't be pressured into accepting a one-sided agreement simply to meet a U.S. political timeline. The tone from the Prime Minister's office was clear. Canada was open to talks, but not at any cost. At the same time, Canadian communities tied to the lumber industry were feeling the pressure. Mill towns and provincial leaders raised concerns about potential layoffs if no resolution was reached soon. Behind closed doors, Canadian policymakers began considering an idea that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years earlier: some form of export quota or restriction on softwood lumber. Historically, U.S. negotiators have pushed for Canada to limit its lumber exports in order to help manage supply and stabilize prices. Canada, however, has always resisted this, seeing it as an infringement on free trade and national sovereignty. But with tariffs mounting and political pressure building, even longtime free trade advocates in Ottawa began to see a carefully managed quota as a potential bargaining chip. something that might help secure a broader, more stable agreement. Momentum for this idea grew after a bipartisan group of U.S. senators visited Ottawa during the summer. These lawmakers were advocating for compromise, specifically a deal under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, that would cap Canadian lumber exports in return for lifting tariffs. Their visit showed that not all voices in Washington supported a prolonged trade fight. There was political appetite, at least in some corners, for a negotiated resolution. Meanwhile, Canadian lumber companies weren't waiting around for governments to sort things out. Recognizing that the U.S. market was becoming more unpredictable and costly to serve, many exporters began shifting their focus elsewhere. Within about a year, the share of Canada's softwood lumber exports going to the U.S. dropped significantly, from around 78% down to just 68%. So where did that nearly 10% shift go? Canadian mills started finding new customers overseas. They expanded into European markets, where construction demand remained strong, and into parts of Asia, where rapidly growing economies were hungry for building materials. This move wasn't easy, but it was a strategic pivot, Canada's way of diversifying and reducing dependence on the U.S. market. Shipping lumber across oceans comes with its own challenges: higher transportation costs, different regulatory standards, and new customer relationships. Still, Canada made it clear that it would not be held hostage by one trading partner. The message: if the U.S. wanted to play hardball, Canada would adapt and find other ways to thrive. In this ongoing trade chess match, Ottawa began moving its pieces carefully. It started quietly leveraging financial influence, weighing structural concessions like quotas, and opening new export channels. Every step was designed to counterbalance Washington's aggressive stance. Back in the U.S., the federal government wasn't relying on tariffs alone to transform the lumber landscape. The Trump administration also launched efforts to increase domestic timber production, effectively trying to fill any gap left by reduced Canadian imports. One of its major initiatives was to boost logging on federal lands by raising timber harvest quotas by about 25%. In theory, this would mean opening up more acres of national forests to logging companies, even revisiting areas previously protected under environmental laws. Specifically, officials proposed loosening the restrictions of the 2001 roadless rule, which had preserved vast swaths of federal land from logging and road construction. By rolling back parts of those protections, the administration aimed to unleash new logging activity in areas that had remained untouched for decades. On paper, increasing federal timber harvests by 25% might seem like a game changer, but forestry experts were quick to dampen expectations. In reality, the U.S. lumber supply depends far more on private lands and market forces than what can be sourced from federal forests, at least in the short term. Even if the government did manage to auction off more timber from national lands, analysts estimated it would only increase the total U.S. wood supply by less than 1%. In practical terms, it's like trying to power a race car through a coffee straw, nowhere near enough to keep the engine running. Many of the federal forests with harvestable trees are located in remote areas that would require expensive new roads to access. Others contain tree species that aren't ideal for modern construction needs. And that's before accounting for the legal roadblocks. Environmental and climate advocacy groups immediately prepared to challenge the rollbacks in court, arguing that opening protected forests to logging would threaten ecosystems and undermine climate goals. Decades of forest protections wouldn't be undone without a legal fight, meaning any theoretical increase in timber supply could be delayed for years. Still, the push to revive logging on federal lands did inspire activity in certain parts of the industry. In regions like the Pacific Northwest and the southern U.S., some sawmill operators saw the policy shift as a green light to invest. American lumber mills began modernizing, adding automation and robotics to their production lines in an effort to improve efficiency, reduce waste, and cut labor costs. If Canadian lumber was going to be more expensive or less available, U.S. producers wanted to be ready to meet demand head-on. For towns that had suffered from past mill closures, places like Washington's Skamania County, which once had half a dozen sawmills, but now has just one, there was cautious optimism. local leaders hoped the renewed focus on domestic logging might bring back jobs and revitalize their economies. But time was not on their side. The housing market needed affordable lumber immediately, not years down the line. Interestingly, Canadian lumber companies themselves began adapting in a very different way. Rather than only fighting the tariffs from across the border, several major Canadian firms started investing directly in the U.S. lumber industry. Their strategy was simple. If exporting lumber to the U.S. was going to be expensive, why not produce it inside the U.S. instead? Companies like West Fraser and Canfor started buying and building sawmills in southern states like Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. These regions offered a combination of timber-rich forests, lower operating costs, and, most importantly, freedom from cross-border tariffs. By processing wood in the U.S., Canadian firms could continue serving American customers while sidestepping trade barriers. It was a smart hedge: shorten the supply chain, avoid duties, and still benefit from strong U.S. demand for lumber. The investment also brought jobs and infrastructure to rural American communities, adding a rare economic silver lining to the broader trade conflict. In fact, the U.S. Lumber Coalition, a vocal supporter of the tariffs, welcomed this trend. From their perspective, Canadian investment in U.S. mills meant more domestic capacity and less reliance on imports. If Canadian companies wanted to create American jobs, so be it. However, not everyone was entirely comfortable. Some industry veterans questioned what this meant for the U.S. versus them framing of the dispute. If Canadian-owned mills are producing lumber within U.S. borders, are they now part of the domestic industry worth protecting? Or are they a new kind of competition for American-owned mills? Regardless of that debate, the short-term impact was clear. Communities receiving new Canadian investment benefited from the jobs and economic activity. Despite all these efforts to increase domestic output, the road ahead remained full of obstacles. Environmental lawsuits threatened to delay or block expanded federal logging. Natural resource limitations were another concern. Trees take years, often decades, to grow to harvestable size. Years of restricted logging can't be reversed overnight. Even on private lands, producers must walk a fine line. Cutting too much too quickly to capitalize on high prices could lead to future shortages or price crashes, a familiar boom and bust pattern in the forestry sector. Plus, critics warned that pushing for aggressive logging could conflict with key public values like wilderness conservation, clean water protection, and climate mitigation through carbon sequestering forests. Put simply, revitalizing domestic logging isn't a light switch you can flip. It's a long, complicated journey full of trade-offs. And meanwhile, the housing and construction sectors continue to need lumber, right now. For the moment, the softwood lumber dispute remains deadlocked. Both sides are holding their ground. Washington is betting that tariffs and domestic investment will pressure Ottawa into a new agreement. Canada, meanwhile, is countering with diversification, economic leverage, and its own policy tools. It's worth remembering, the last softwood lumber agreement expired back in 2015. Since then, the two countries have operated without a stable trade framework. This makes the current standoff a major test case under the USMCA. Some trade analysts have proposed a new agreement that would suspend tariffs and introduce export quotas to create predictability for both markets. Others have floated more innovative solutions, like joint investment in forestry technology or agreements on sustainable harvesting standards that could benefit both countries over the long term. Whatever the path forward, it won't be easy. Crafting a deal will require political will and compromise, despite mounting domestic pressures on both sides. But it's not impossible. And as the economic costs of a prolonged trade war grow, the urgency for a resolution will only increase. What's certain is this: the outcome of this lumber conflict will be felt far beyond sawmills and forests. It will shape housing, investment, jobs, and cross-border relations for years to come. The deeper cost of this tariff conflict won't necessarily be found in spreadsheets or immediate pricing data. Instead, it will ripple through the structure of the global economy over time. The US may collect tariff revenues and declare victory in specific trade battles. But if it ends up standing alone, with weakened alliances and reduced global influence, it risks losing something far greater: its leadership in the world economy. That's the emerging lesson from this turbulent chapter. In trade, as in diplomacy, when your closest partners begin to step away, it becomes much harder to win them back.